Welcome to Our Canada, Our Future. I'm Aaron Woodrick. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about the interplay between Indigenous rights and environmental activism, and what some view as an attempt by the latter to interfere with the former, and what some Indigenous critics are calling eco-colonialism. And to discuss this issue, I'm very pleased to be joined by Chris Sankey, who's a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute and president of Blackfish Enterprises. Chris, I want to thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
I thought, Chris, maybe we could just start by maybe talking a bit about yourself, explaining your roles in the community, both in politics and in business.
Yeah, right now I'm a advisor to industry in Indigenous. I currently co-facilitate an all Indigenous leadership table where we look at traditional knowledge, political risk, and a path forward. So a lot of that is looking at common interests. So it's key. And I think it's important to note that this is a part of social innovation.
Okay. Now, as I mentioned off the top, there's a critique of some of environmental activism, sort of co-opting Indigenous interests, sort of advance their own agenda. And the term eco-colonialism, I know, is something that you've used in the past. So maybe you could sort of explain to us, what do you mean by eco-colonialism? What does that term refer to?
Well, it's just a modern day Indian Act. It's a bunch of white individuals trying to tell Indigenous people how to live and take care of the land. They're coming in trying to push their green agenda without no input from the Indigenous communities, trying to force down our throats what and how we should be taking care of our backyard. I think Indigenous people have been taking care of the environment and growing the economy since time immemorial. I always like to tell people, Indigenous people have been in business for the last 10,000 years. It's just now we just got back on track.
Right, fair enough. And I mean, I guess that leads to my next question is when we talk about eco-colonialism, in what ways is that activism hurting Indigenous people in Canada?
Oh, they claim to be allies of the Indigenous face, but in reality, they're actually hurting our reputation. They're hurting the relationships. They've been able to win the battle in mainstream media where they provoke public interest that somehow Indigenous people are against development. And that's simply not true. The vast majority of us want responsible resource development. We just want to be able to do it on our terms. Back in the day, they used to be able to try and fit a round peg in a square hole, and it just didn't work. And so now, anytime since I can remember, Indigenous people are the face of the next major projects in this country. And eco-activism has been killing significant amount of projects in this country, and it's hurting the economic and social well-being of our communities. So they need to move on. I don't know how many times Indigenous leaders in this country have told these activists to leave our territories and leave our challenges unto ourselves. And if we got internal disputes, if there's disagreements, let us solve that. Nobody else is going to solve that but us.
Yeah, fair enough. Speaking of the activism, I know earlier this year, of course, we had a big protest here in Ottawa, the Freedom Convoy that was protesting for several weeks in Ottawa. And there was some concern about foreign funding of those protesters. A lot of that's turned out not to be true. But I think you'd also made an observation elsewhere that if we're going to talk about foreign funding of activism, we should probably talk about it in the environmental sense as well. So what is your understanding of where a lot of the funding for environmental activism comes from?
Oh, it's coming from the Getty family in Beverly Hills, California. It's no secret. It's just bizarre that people would think that foreign funding is okay. Foreign funding is okay if it's done responsibly. I'm not against that, but these eco-activists have been able to do one thing, and that's gain money from an interest group that wants to shut down Canada's natural resource development sector. And it's with intent, and it's with strategic moves in this country, and it needs to stop. People want to complain about the Freedom Convoy and somehow they were foreign funded, when the reality is that the vast majority of the money that was raised in the Freedom Convoy came right from Canadians, whereas 90+% of the funding that's coming in from The Old Growth Forest campaign, Save the Old Growth Forest campaign, is coming from the United States. And it's easy for people to say that we don't have a problem with foreign funding. Well, they're not the ones having to live with this and having to fight these battles every day to get rid of them.
Welcome back to Our Canada, Our Future. We're talking eco-colonialism today with Chris Sankey, Senior Fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Chris, I wanted to play devil's advocate with you a little bit here. You know, there are a lot of critics who argue that resource development actually isn't in the interest of Indigenous Canadians. So what do you say to those people?
Well, first of all, they don't live in these remote communities where they don't have sole source revenues, even proper infrastructure to function as a day-to-day operation as a community should. Without natural resources taking place in this country, we just won't be able to have the sustainable development future that everybody strives to have. When we take a look at what's happening, all of the natural resources happen in our backyard. And it's important to note that if these resources are going to be extracted in our backyard, Indigenous people should have a seat, a say, and decision-making powers and having ownership to move forward. So, look, we've taken care of the environment since time immemorial, and we'll continue to take care of the environment as the years come by. But at the end of the day, natural resources have been in our backyard forever, and we know how to manage it. And it's an opportunity for us to be in the boardroom to make those decisions.
Yeah, good point. And I suppose it's a lot easier to be against development when you're sitting in a nice house in Los Angeles, right, rather than living in a more remote community. Chris, obviously you're part of a generation of new, sort of younger voices in the Indigenous community. Why don't you think that up until this point, Canadians have heard a lot from pro-development Indigenous voices? I think for a long time, there were a lot of people that sort of assumed that the entire Indigenous community was against development. But as you say, there are a lot of pro-development voices. So, what's taken so long, and do you see this trend continuing to change?
Well, I mean, I'm just as frustrated as the next person as to why mainstream media doesn't focus on the good. I mean, I don't know why. Maybe they just don't think it's sexy enough with today's narrative. And today's narrative is green. Everything's green. If you take a look at the commercials, you take a look at segments on mainstream media, either A, it's about the environment, or B, it's about Indigenous people against resource development. And that is simply not true. The vast majority of us want responsible resource development. That would be a way better story for mainstream media to pick up on, is the fact that we are not only going to help get away from managing poverty, we're going to start managing wealth. We're going to start to be a part of the Canadians' economic engine. We're going to start to extract and be responsible on how we move and get our resources to market. I mean, that's just a better story. And for some reason, mainstream media just does not want to pick up on it. And somehow they've been, the reality is they've been speaking with individuals in the cities that claim that we are all against resource development, which is not true. You take a look at some of the organizations in the city, like UBCIC, they've been very vocal about oil and gas when they have no concept, or even they've been out of touch with reality of what Indigenous communities want. I mean, for an Indigenous organization to continue to come out and attack a resource that's going to help break the poverty cycle is just crazy. They need to stop doing that. And they need to stop talking for all of us. And I have no problem addressing the issue. We need to be able to sit down across one another and have responsible discussions about how best we're going to grow this economy. But the mainstream media needs to get away from this nonsense that somehow we're all against responsible resource development. What's frustrating to me is that if you take a look at the Haisla, you take a look at the Nisga'a, and even the Sipshean, of all the opportunities that are in front of them, including the Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh and those communities in the south, all these projects continue to move forward. I mean, how could you say that Indigenous communities are against responsible resource development in the oil and gas sector when these very projects like Cedar in Kitimat, like wood fiber in the Squamish territory, and like Kay Elizabeth's government and with their LNG, and then the port-related development opportunities, both north and south. How could you say we're against responsible resource development or development in general when all of this activity continues to happen? The governments are engaged with us. They never come out publicly and say that they're in support of oil and gas, but somehow in the media they continue to say they're against the reduction of emissions. But yet we're the ones working with environmental groups that are there for the right reasons. We're the ones that are working with biologists and those that are in the business of reducing emissions. And we're the ones engaging on how best we can move forward in this transition within the oil and gas sector. It's not these individuals that are living in the city. And I mean, we're the ones doing this. We're doing the heavy lifting. And in the end, everyone's going to benefit.
Yeah, really good and passionate points, Chris. We're going to take a short break and be right back. Welcome back to Our Canada, Our Future. We're talking eco-colonialism and resource development with Chris Sankey, who's a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Chris, we've talked a lot about the challenges. I kind of want to talk a bit about the future. What do you sort of see? What's your vision for how Indigenous Canadians can start building better futures for themselves and become sort of more full partners in helping building Canada together?
Well, look, part of my job is to help stop economic leakage within our communities. We should be front and center championing these opportunities in the resource sector. I envision a time where we're going to be the next global powerhouse to make these crucial decisions that's going to help grow this country's economic engine. And it's already happening in every part of this country. If you take a look back east with the Member 2 and the Mi'kmaq people there in the lobster fishery, you take a look in the in the northern parts of Ontario, they're looking at the mining sector. You take a look in Alberta west into BC, you're looking at mining, oil and gas, forestry. We're looking at way better ways to do conservation with fisheries. So when you take a look at what's happening in this country, and that they're in the boardroom with the peers in industry to make sure that we're going to look at how we're going to generate sole source revenues for the next 7 generations where we are managing wealth and not poverty.
Yeah, great points. I wanted to ask what you'd like to see more from political leaders when it comes to making it easier for Indigenous groups to help develop these resources to empower Indigenous communities. What kind of changes do you think are necessary sort of at the political level?
I think I get very frustrated with this, as you know, Aaron. I'm quite vocal on Twitter and LinkedIn. My frustration with today's political leadership is that, one, they're supporting us behind the scenes. They are. We're having these discussions. They are having these discussions with leadership. But when it comes to the media, that's where the eco-colonialists and activists lose their minds. When they find out places like Pachita are going to move forward in cutting their old growth timber, which, by the way, it's their right. It's within their treaty rights. Who are we to tell anybody who can cut down a stick of wood? They've been doing conservation forever. When you take a look at the Sipshian, the Nishka, the Haisla, and all those communities are situated in prime locations to get access to market. We're moving forward, but what frustrates me is the political powers that be won't come out and support us publicly. Why? It's going to benefit the system. It's going to benefit a massive tax base, which will pay for the governing programs, that will pay for salaries, pay for services. But you don't want to come out and publicly support us because you want to cater this narrative to your voting base. And that's my frustration with government. I don't like how they've approached this, because the messaging is so polarizing that in the middle, Indigenous people are caught. We're caught in the middle of this debate on should or shouldn't we produce or move natural resources in this province, in this country. Is because the political leaders that be continue to talk about this transition, and they keep saying that this relationship is the most important since they can remember, but yet their messaging to Canadians is that we're going to get away from oil and gas, when that is not true. We're not getting away from oil and gas. Without oil and gas, we don't have renewable diesel. We can't get to blue and green hydrogen. We have an opportunity to do this now where we're looking at sustainable development in the resource sector. There's new opportunities to look at ammonia, which is a transport fuel to move hydrogen. There's ways to do this with canola oil and making sure we could get access and partner with First Nations and agricultural lands. There's all these wonderful things that are happening within the industry itself. And it's not these eco-activists that are doing any of this. So far to date, all they've been able to do is really spout off the same messaging that our current political bodies are doing. And that's what's polarizing the messaging. You got one hand where the Canadian government continues to say, and British Columbia government continue to say we're going to move to EVs, turbines, and solar. And then you have us that are saying, wait a second, we want to be in control of our resource development sector. And those two bodies need to come together and start being open and honest with the general public about your support for Indigenous communities in the natural resource sector.
Yeah, great points, Chris. We're going to take a short break and be right back. Welcome back to Our Canada, Our Future. We're talking eco-colonialism and resource development with Chris Sankey, who's a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Chris, you sort of gave us a long, great spiel on the sort of hypocrisy of a lot of politicians. I wanted to get your thoughts on some of the more recent developments that may impact the ability of natural resource projects to get moving in this country. Of course, we have a war in Ukraine. Russia has invaded Ukraine. That has kind of been a reality check for a lot of the world in terms of our energy needs. I wanted to get your thoughts on whether you see this as an opportunity for Canada to maybe have a reset on energy policy and maybe take a more realistic approach in terms of balancing fighting climate change with developing our resources.
Well, look, if anything, the unfortunate circumstances that are happening in Ukraine has really shone a light of the importance of our natural resource sector. But when you take a look at even last year with the floods in the Fraser Valley, when TMX had to turn off the taps for safety reasons, by the way, not one drop of oil was ever leaked from that disaster when the levees broke. But it showed that we had to rely on the lower 48 to get our jet fuel to a YVR. So when we don't produce, we get ourselves into a lot of trouble, as we've seen clearly. I always try to see these difficult circumstances as the glass half full. You have to, being an entrepreneur, you have to look at the brighter side of stuff, no matter how bad the situation is. Canada has an opportunity to produce their natural resources so that in the future, we don't ever run into this again. It's important and it's crucial. Data has come out that by 2030, the demand for oil and gas is going to stay relatively the same, if not greater than what we're seeing today going into 2050. Look, everybody wants to reduce emissions. I want to reduce emissions. I want to reduce our carbon footprint. But we also need to understand that the carbon in the air is food for the trees. So we got to have that balance. And I feel like those that are pro-development, like myself and many other communities, feel that their voices are getting drowned out, when yet in reality, if we could approach this in a balanced way and have a frank, honest, constructive conversation, we could make sure both needs are met, both in the sustainable development arena and both in the oil and gas sector. I go back to Elon Musk's comment. I mean, he's probably the greatest producer of the EV electrical car. And he flat out came out and said that we need the oil and gas sector to thrive. We have to. There's not enough materials on the planet to meet the needs when it comes to turbines and solar. They're just not. And in fact, they're not even efficient. So without the oil and gas sector to produce hydrocarbons, all those stores that everybody relies on, like Amazon, Canadian Tire, IKEA, and all of that, what are they going to do? How are they going to be able to operate without hydrocarbons? I'm in favor of looking at anything to look to produce a cleaner burning fuel that takes care of the environment and grows the economy.
Now, Chris, you talked a little bit earlier about development, and you just didn't say development at any cost. You said responsible development. So maybe you could talk a little bit about the importance of ensuring that development is responsible and why Indigenous people place such a high value on that.
Well, I mean, again, it goes back to just traditionally how we lived as a society is we always took what we needed and made sure we did it in a conservative manner. We've always been responsible when it comes to our land because the land is our identity. It explains who we are since time immemorial. And there's nobody that I know that would ever want to develop the oil and gas sector or forestry sector or fishery sector in an irresponsible manner that could hurt us, just as we've seen how the fishery was managed. We don't want to ever go down that road again. It's our opportunity to look at a better way how we could best grow the economy through responsible development. We want to be a part of this economic engine. In order to do that, we got to be able to be in front and center, like I said, in the boardroom, making these decisions and how best we could grow the economy and take care of it. We all want to do that. Every Canadian I to do that. And right now, we got to work together and come together in order to do that.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Chris. I want to thank you very much for joining us. Very important topic that I think a lot of Canadians agree is going to have a great impact on our future. So again, I want to thank Chris. I want to thank you for joining us all, and we'll see you next time on Our Canada, Our Future.